Okay. All right. So, like I said, it's good to see everyone. And our portion today is Terumah. And I wanted to spend some time, though we've probably done this last year and the year before as well. I wanted to spend time on the commentary below the line on page 485. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shekidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So Terumah begins Exodus chapter 25, and we're on page 485 in the Eitz Chaim. And I just want to, before we get into the commentary, I just want to remind us of the context. So the immediate context begins with chapter 20, in which we heard the Ten Commandments. So it's the recording. Chapter 20 is from the portion Yitro, is a recording of God speaking the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai, and then Moses setting up an altar. And then all of the portion Mishpatim which was last week's portion, is further, you could see it in context as filling in the gaps with the Ten Commandments. So that you got the Ten Commandments as kind of broad statements, as foundational ethical, moral, religious principles of Israelite society, and then adding more details that the portion Mishpatim adds to flesh it out a bit. Certainly not all of the 613 commandments are mentioned in last week's portion, but certainly the basis for a lot of civil law is in how to run a civil society was given in last week's portion. And now it seems to shift to focus solely on religious worship. So we go from law to worship. And the obvious question is this a new subject, or is it a different aspect of the same subject? Meaning, if the Torah is supposed to be a guidebook for understanding how we are supposed to relate to God in our lives, then are we relating to God as expressed in Mishpatim, or are we relating to God as expressed in this portion, Terumah, which is all about how to build the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary? And even further than that, is it an either-or question? In other words, perhaps we worship God both by means of the laws given in Mishpatim and the commandments given in Terumah, which is also in Tetzaveh and in Vayakel and in Pekudei and in most of the book of Leviticus, all about how to build the place to worship, and then what are the means by which we are worshiping. Okay, so these are broader questions that we rightly ask as we just one second, let me just mute all, and certainly you can unmute yourselves over the course. Okay, so these are the questions that I'm keeping everybody on mute unless anybody has a question or a comment. So these are the questions that we are supposed to ask as we read the Torah. Is the Ten Commandments and God communicating to us through the Ten Commandments and then the laws. Is that the way? Is that the what the Torah is all about? In other words, it's all about how we're supposed to act, or is it about Terumah, and that is how we're supposed to worship, or is it both? So I would say, before we look at the commentary on 485, I would say it's all the above. Okay, and I've always said, when I've talked about the commandments and understanding the 613 commandments, and more specifically, how we understand halakha, Jewish law, and this comes up in discussion about the differences between the conservative movement and other non-Orthodox denominations of Judaism, right? So conservative Judaism ideologically says that halakha is part and parcel of what it means to be Jewish, okay? Whereas the Reform movement says, and I'm overgeneralizing, that it's up to each individual to decide whether they want to observe halakha or not. And the Reconstructionist movement, again, oversimplifying, it's cultural norms as opposed to law. So I always understand my observance of halakha as an opportunity to express belief in God. So if we apply this to American law, it would be kind of funny to say that when I observe the speed limit, that it's an opportunity to experience God in my life, as kind of a weird kind of understanding, right? So that when you get in your car and you drive, that's an opportunity to experience God, not so much. But Jewish law very, very specifically says, as an underpinning, that's what it's all about. That when we put a fence around a pit in our field to protect someone from falling into the pit, that's reflecting the idea that we respect other human beings in our neighborhood, and we value human life, which is a Jewish concept, and that we're seeing God in putting up a fence around the pit in our field. Okay, so behavior that the Torah teaches us and the rabbis further interpret through the Mishnah and the Talmud is at its core an attempt to experience God in our life as much as possible every day, 365 days a year. Okay, so when we look at the portion Terumah, which begins these 4 portions, or 4.5 portions, if we count the beginning of Kitisa as well. So Terumah, Tetzaveh, beginning of Kitisa, and then Vayakel and Pekude are all about how to build the Mishkan and then building the Mishkan. Okay, so the first 2.5 portions about how to do it and everything that goes into it, including the vestments for the Kohanim, and then Vayakel and Pekude, how the Israelites followed through on that design. Okay, so it's a lot of space given in the Torah to it, which then continues with the book of Leviticus on how to offer the sacrifices in that space. So we would think it would be right to assume that that's what the Torah is all about. Since Vayikra is the middle book of the Torah, maybe the most, you could argue then by placement that it's the most important book of the Torah, that it's the core of the Torah itself. It's all about Torah. Jewish practice is all about worship. But I would argue, no, it's not just about that. And I'm going to share something else on Shabbat, just all about the importance of the Mishkan itself, and whether that was really in the rest of the Bible, really the focus of Jewish practice. Okay, so that's just like the background to where Terumah is coming in, and then there's also just thinking about it in the context from which the Torah makes it seem that all these chapters are happening, right? So by that I mean we've gone from the portion Bishalach, which describes the exodus from Egypt and the crossing of the sea, and also the battle with the Amalekites. So we go from crossing the sea and battling the Amalekites all within about a week to 10 days time, right? They start to leave their homes in Egypt, the beginning of Passover. They cross the sea according to tradition on the seventh day of Passover, then have the battle with the Amalekites a couple days later, okay? And then we get to the portion Yitro, which is about 6 weeks later, 7 weeks later, when they're at Mount Sinai, hearing the 10 Commandments. And then the portion Mishpatim as well, so maybe 40 days after the 10 Commandments were given, and then the portion Terumah. So all within the first 4 or 5 months after leaving Egypt, all of this important, profound stuff is being shared with the people. It's a lot to digest, even as a reader in 2023. But imagine if this was happening in real time 3,000 years ago. It's what a tremendous upheaval in the lives of the people at the time, that they have to leave their homes, they experience great miracles and trauma at the sea, and this awesome event of crossing the sea and then watching the Egyptian army drown behind them. Can't imagine a combination of great victory and sadness as well, overwhelming, profound. I don't know, how do you react to that, seeing such tragedy happen, but not to you, to your enemy? So those great roller coaster feelings at the sea, and then having to gird your strength to fight the Amalekites, and then march through the desert for a few weeks to get to Mount Sinai while manna is falling every day, so you're being sustained. It's just, your senses are being overwhelmed, right? So the people of Israel are on sensory overload. So what's coming to mind as I'm saying this, it's common now for toddlers, like preschool kids and younger, when they're in a loud place, to have like these headphones on there. You may see this. You might be familiar with your own grandchildren having this. So it's not like they're listening to music in these headphones, but these are like people working at the airport on the tarmac, that are directing the airplanes back and forth to the gate. They wear these noise canceling headphones. So that it's kind of like what the people of Israel needed for these several weeks in their lives. And so and that's just what they're experiencing. And then on top of that, they have to learn all the Torah that Moses is teaching them. So if you're on sensory overload, it's nearly impossible to learn. Okay, so the little bit I know about education, and I have a master's in Jewish education, but the little bit I know about special education, right, applying education to all kinds of different kinds of learning, I just understand the more someone is distracted, the harder it is to learn. right? And so my wife, Lenore, deals with this every day in her job at the Jewish day school, trying to provide the best kind of learning for all the students at the day school so that no matter what kind of learning need they have, they can learn. So some kids simply need like a fidget. They need to be able to stand. They need to be able to walk around. They need to have special chairs. They need to have special tables and desks and whatnot. And that's because of some kids that have, and some of them have a separate room to go to, a resource room or a learning room that is a more sensory sensitive kind of room for them. So what I'm suggesting is that the entire people of Israel, whether they're on these kinds of people or not, suggest that they are on sensory overload. And when that happens, it's nearly impossible to be able to pay attention and to learn and digest the laws that are being taught. Right. So I hadn't thought about this before. Just as I was talking and explaining the context, this just came to me that we can imagine then why the Israelites might have questioned and disobeyed the rules, because maybe they were just not in a position to be able to appreciate all the Torah that Moses was teaching. Moses was able to go up on Mount Sinai for 40 days and have solitude up there and have this incredible one-on-one experience with God. The people of Israel did not have that 40 days to be able to digest the Torah from Moses, right? So after Terumah and Tetzaveh, they spend the rest of the year building the Mishkan. Maybe at that time they're doing it, but there's also the golden calf that happens in between as well. So I just wanted to spend some time on all of this context and for us to better appreciate where the portion Terumah comes in. Okay, so now let's look at the commentary below the line on 485 just to get some other ideas about this. The last third of the book of Exodus, beginning here with chapter 25, concerns itself entirely, except for the incident of the golden calf, which we'll get to in 2 weeks in the portion Kitisa, with the construction of the tabernacle, a portable shrine to house the ark, and the tablets of the pact. Okay, so that's what this Mishkan is. There are two terms that are used interchangeably, the Mishkan and the Ohel Moed. Okay, so the Ohel Moed is this tent of meeting. Maybe that's where the tablets go and are stored there. But they're stored in the ark, where the ark is, in the Ohel Moed, in the Mishkan, right? So interchangeable. Just if you Google images, biblical tabernacle, or if you image, so right, when you search in Google, you have the option to search images. So if you do images for Mishkan, you'll see a variety of renderings that will come up in which artists and scholars over the centuries have tried to depict in visual form what the words are describing. Okay? And those of us who remember the library on Lockwood Drive, it's somewhere in the library now in our building here. There's a book called The Tabernacle, which has color pictures trying to depict what this whole thing looked like. Okay. After the life-altering experience of standing at Sinai, how does one keep the feeling of Sinai present? Okay, so this, I would argue, this is for the reader to kind of ask this question, because I think as the Torah is describing it, I don't think the people are in a position yet to want to keep the Sinai experience alive. Because you can also argue, based on what the Torah describes, that people are really afraid of what's happening at Mount Sinai, and they ask Moses to be the intermediary for them. They're scared of all the sights and sounds that they're experiencing on the mountain, and they say a couple of times in the portion Yitro, Moses, we're too frightened here. You go on up the mountain, right? So to say this here, that the people want to keep the Mount Sinai experience alive, I'm not so sure. I think that's us reading back into the text, right? The rabbis imagine in the Mishnah and the Talmud what it must have been like, and they wish they were there. And that part of what it means to be a rabbi, that is studying Torah every day, is a way to try to re-experience Mount Sinai. Okay, so it's perhaps the commentary is reading back into the text, saying, boy, we wish we were there. And I'm just presenting from how we're reading the text itself and what actually may have happened. Not so sure that the people themselves who experienced Mount Sinai would have wanted to keep that Sinai experience alive. Okay, but we as the reader are trying to put this religious experience of reading the Torah into our own religious context. So how can we keep the Sinai experience alive every single day? So it can be maintained with sacred deeds, daily acts of justice and compassion, as outlined in the previous parsha, Mishpatim, right? So perhaps, as I was explaining, what my interpretation of Jewish law is and why I observe the commandments, it's an opportunity to have a mini form of Mount Sinai while I'm eating a kosher lunch, while I'm teaching a Torah study class, while I'm davening the morning service, while I am talking to other human beings in a respectful way. All of these are the opportunity to keep Mount Sinai alive. Okay? Or it can be accomplished by maintaining the observance of sacred time on Shabbat and holy days, which there was a reference to in the Ten Commandments, right? The fourth of the Ten Commandments is about Shabbat. Or it can be maintained with sacred space, fashioning a physical site to represent the presence of God in the midst of the community, right? So how do we keep Mount Sinai alive within us? Well, it's through sacred deeds, sacred time, and sacred space. So it's a combination of those three sacred elements of life. Typically, the Torah and later Jewish usage will blend all three modes, sacred deeds, space, and time, into an integrated way of life, right? So that's just how the rabbis did it. And Judaism today, based on the rabbis, is a combination of deeds, space, and time, right? So that the ultimate form of Jewish expression would be in the synagogue on Shabbat and holidays, okay? So coming together to perform a sacred deed at a sacred time in a sacred place. Doesn't mean you can't be Jewish not in the sacred space, and it doesn't mean you can't be Jewish not in a sacred time, that is not on Shabbat and holidays, but coming together, the most sacred, and you could argue then Yom Kippur would be the most sacred of all sacred times, observed in the most sacred of spaces, the synagogue, with the most sacred of deeds, everything we're supposed to do on Yom Kippur, okay? So the ultimate goal is to break through the barriers and come into the presence of God, right? So the more mystical in the community would actually want to try then to elevate, like separate out of our physical body and be able to elevate to God's presence. Okay, so the second best is what we do in trying to feel as if God is with us in all the Jewish things we do, right? And so no matter how hard we try, and no matter how hard we pray in synagogue, or there could be times in synagogue where we feel as if God is there. I have had those moments, but it doesn't happen all the time. Or there could be other times in our experiences of Jewish life outside of the synagogue that we can feel as if God is there. Okay, so that's the goal of religious life, is to feel as if God is there with us and that we are in God's presence, right? So it's pretty awesome when you feel it, but it's also at the same time pretty frightening because it's a different kind of feeling. All right, so it happens. I've told the story before that we remember the tragedy that happened in 1995 when four members of a member of our synagogue, Irma Goff, four members of her family were murdered. Right, so and we also remember that one of Cantor Levin's children died at the age of 21, 22. So there were times on Lockwood Drive when on Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, Irma Goff would have the honor of opening the Ark for the Unatana Tokef prayer, and Dahlia and Cantor Levin would be doing the duet during Unatana Tokef. So, and Unatana Tokef, the prayer talking about who shall live, who shall die, to have Irma Goff, members of her family tragically murdered, standing at the Ark, and we're experiencing Irma at the Ark and Dahlia and Cantor Levin singing back and forth to each other, both experiencing the loss of a child sibling. So that's just an incredible kind of experience that often, and it happened several high holidays that they would have those honors, that was a pretty awesome, not in a good way, but awesome in terms of a powerful feeling that would happen on Rosh Hashanah, on the high holidays. So it's that kind of experience, if we know what's going on and know the content of the prayer, that's a pretty incredible kind of experience. So that, if that's the goal of religious life, it's pretty overwhelming. And I think the average person might not be able to handle that much sanctity all the time. So even though the rabbis say that should be the goal of every Jew, to experience that as much as possible, it's really hard to do. But if we can keep it in mind every time we do Jewish things, then that's half the battle right there. Okay. So that we go on in that paragraph, but that goal is not attained in an instant. That is, being in the presence of God. There is a ladder of spiritual ascent alluded to in the prayer which precedes the Shema in our morning service, where the text moves from the study of Torah to the performance of mitzvot to bonding with God. I would argue it's with the evening service too, where the prayers go from a recognition of the world around us and the cycle of seasons and how God is involved in that, to the place of human beings in the world, to the place of the Jewish community in the world with the gift of the Torah, to the Shema, in which we are accepting upon ourselves our connection to the covenant. Okay, so it's both in the evening and in the morning service that happens. Mount Sinai, Mount Sinai does not retain its holiness after the Israelites move on. This is another interesting side comment that the commentary is making now, right? So, in other words, why are the people building a portable sanctuary if Mount Sinai is already a holy place? If God has already descended on Mount Sinai and the people experience God's presence there, why do you need to build a sanctuary? You got a place already. This is the place where God is. So Mount Sinai does not retain its holiness after the Israelites move on. It does not become a site of pilgrimage, right? So throughout the rest of the Bible, nowhere do we have, no. Yeah, it becomes a place of escape. Elijah escapes the wrath of Queen Jezebel and King Ahab and goes to Mount Horeb to escape. And there he hears God in a still small voice. So Mount Horeb, which is another word for Mount Sinai, becomes a place of refuge, but it's not a place of pilgrimage. Nowhere in the rest of the Bible do the people of Israel make any kind of trip to Mount Sinai in order to re-experience Mount Sinai, which is fascinating. Just fascinating. If Mount Sinai is the only time where the entire community experienced God's presence, why aren't the people going back again? Why isn't it part of the Shavuot observance in the land of Israel to go to Mount Sinai to re-experience Mount Sinai? It's just a fascinating religious evolutionary idea, right? So in other words, we move on from the Sinai experience to try to make that experience as portable as possible. So the mountain is not holy. God is holy. And God's presence is what makes a place holy. So God isn't only found at Mount Sinai. God theoretically is found everywhere. If we are in the right spiritual mindset, God can be and can be experienced anywhere and everywhere. When the people leave Sinai, they do not leave God. God accompanies them on their journey, and the tabernacle is to be a symbol of that. The later temples built in Jerusalem by Solomon and by the Jews returning from Babylonia, and I would add also augmented by King Herod, did not follow the plan given here. Different generations build their houses of worship in ways appropriate to their own times and needs. All right, so we'll read like the Haftorah for Terumah is taken from the first book of Kings with the beginning of the plan of King Solomon's temple. And the Haftorah for Tetzaveh is Ezekiel's vision of what the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem after returning from Babylonian exile will look like. And neither temple, so Ezekiel's vision doesn't jibe with King Solomon's temple, which doesn't jibe with a description of the Mishkan here. Okay, so it's not exactly the details that are important. What's important is the attempt on the part of the people to build an appropriate sanctuary in which we can have a place to experience God through worship. Bravanel, who was in Spain at the time of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492, suggests that one purpose of the tabernacle was to combat the idea that God had forsaken the earth, choosing to reside exclusively in heaven, remote from humanity. Right? So that's an interesting idea. Is God found in heaven alone? And our role as a mystic, mysticism was a big deal in Spain at Abravanel's time and before him. Is our goal to elevate out of our bodies to get to God in heaven? Or can God be found on earth? The sages calculated that the command to build a tabernacle was given on Yom Kippur, the 10th of Tishrei. And that's just through rabbinic teaching, right? So there was, and this is based on the idea that the command of Terumah happened after the golden calf. Okay, so and the commentary will get to that in a moment, but if we do the chronology that way, that the Ten Commandments was in the 6th of Sivan, so 7 weeks after they left Egypt, and then there was 40 days that Moses was up on the mountain, and then he came down the mountain with the Ten Commandments, which he then broke when he saw them worshiping the golden calf, and then went up the mountain again for 40 more days to come down with the Ten Commandments again. Maybe by doing that, you get to the 10th of Tishrei for Yom Kippur. Okay. The tabernacle would be a tent of witness to the fact that God was still in Israel's midst, even when they fall short of what they had promised to be. Right? So on the holiest day in which we're asking God for forgiveness, the tabernacle, then the commands to build a tabernacle, which happened on Yom Kippur, would mean here's something you can do to show that you have sincerely atoned for your transgressions. There's also a tradition that the instructions to fashion a tabernacle actually were given after the events recounted in Exodus 32, when the Israelites made the golden calf. Again, so that's what so the Torah does not always present events in strict chronologic order, right? When we were doing the Torah class on Friday mornings, and we were in this section of Exodus, there was lengthy commentary there from the traditional commentators about when are these chapters presented in the order in which they are published in the Torah, or were events really out of order? And many of the commentators agree with what's presented here, that we really should understand the golden calf is happening first, and then the portion Terumah happens next, which then calls into question, right, the chronology of events. And perhaps it makes sense why the people were asking Aaron for the golden calf to be fashioned, right? If I presented it as sensory overload, and then all of a sudden there's nothing happening, right? Because Moses has gone up the mountain for 40 days, the people are left alone. They're like they miss what was going on, and they needed something else in front of them. So you could understand then, kind of psychologically, temperamentally, why the golden calf happened. And then things got settled after the golden calf, and then they could focus on building a tabernacle. Maybe that makes sense psychologically. The incident of the golden calf becomes less of a threat to sever the relationship between God and Israel when we know beforehand that reconciliation will follow. Following the latter tradition stated above, Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, a Hasidic rabbi, suggests that God has to command Moses to speak to the Israelites, right? So we have the second verse, Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, God spoke to Moses saying, and then verse 2, Daber el Bnei Yisrael. So God is speaking to Moses and commanding him to speak to the people of Israel about starting to build the tabernacle. So why does it say this? Suggests that God has to command Moses to speak to the Israelites because Moses is so angry at them after the incident of the golden calf. God has to remind him that a leader should never give up on his people, no matter how much they may disappoint him. Right? So Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, taking on the understanding that this portion actually happens after the golden calf, sees evidence for that in just how God has to command Moses to speak to the people. Moses could have been fed up with them, want nothing to do with them, and which he says in the portion Kitisa, and God has to convince him and command him to speak to the people. Okay, any questions or comments about this lengthy introduction? So I want to let's look at the very next word where I left off in the Hebrew on 486 verse 2. Daber el bnei Israel, speak to the people of Israel, v'yikhu li terumah me'et kol ish asher yidvenu libo tikhu et terumati. So if I'm translating literally, they should take for me an elevated, a raised up offering from among all the people whose hearts so move them. You should take this elevated offering. Okay, the English translation doesn't have it that way. Speak to the Israelite people to bring me gifts. You shall accept gifts from me, from every person whose heart so moves him. Okay, so the way I translate it reflects the interesting use of language here and verbs. Take for me an elevated offering. Okay, a terumah. Terumah is actually something that has to be offered from agricultural produce of the land of Israel every year of the 7-year cycle. So terumah is a big deal. It becomes a big deal. It's not just used here for the building of the tabernacle, right? In terms of the donations given, the donation is called a terumah, but it's also used to define the agricultural produce given to the Kohen or all of the Kohanim every year of the 7-year cycle. And terumah is something that only Kohanim are allowed to eat. So there's a lot of discussion in the Mishnah about what constitutes terumah, what happens when it's designated, how it's given to the Kohanim, where it's supposed to be eaten, etc., etc. So the term terumah, not just used here, but also used later in rabbinic literature. But that gift, the unique word for it is terumah because it's a sanctified gift. So because it's sanctified, it's elevated. It's raised up from its regular usage to holy usage. Okay, so if let's say there's also the idea that people could consecrate something that is regular to be given to the Kohanim. Once that is consecrated, it can only be used for that purpose, and it transforms the object to this new level, right? It's an elevated level. So terumah then, so by giving these objects for the design and building of the Mishkan, these objects are raised up, which is the root of the word terumah. The objects are raised up into a hallowed, sanctified condition. Okay, so that's about the word terumah. V'yikhuli, you should take for me. It's just unusual usage of the language. They should bring. It's translated as bring me terumah. Okay, but that's not what the Hebrew says. Take for me. So why is it worded that way? And the commentary here points out the unusual usage, but doesn't really answer the question in the way I want it to be answered. In other words, we have the whole book of Leviticus is about bringing offerings, lahakriv korban. So why isn't a verb used to reflect why not yarumu li truma? Okay, or yarimu li truma. Okay, why not raise up for me a truma? Use the noun truma and make it a verb as yarimu li truma. That would make more sense. But so take for me a truma. So that's what I'm having difficulty with, and I think that the commentators have had difficulty with that. Let's take a look and see if this first paragraph below the line on 486. To bring me gifts, Hebrew v'yikuli, gifts from what was originally mine and which I shared with you. The gold, silver, and jewels that the Israelites would give were taken from the Egyptians when they left Egypt. So maybe the v'yikuli means take from me from that stash. Remember, the Egyptians showered the Israelites with gold and silver and garments as they were leaving Egypt. So that stash, God told Moses that that's what was going to happen, and then it did happen. So that's God's stash already that the people were keeping. So take from that stash. Maybe that's what's missing. There should be a bracket. Take for me from that stash of what the Egyptians showered you, end of bracket, as a truma. Okay, so maybe that's what the commentary is trying to teach us here. They were not to be used for personal benefit, but for something holy and transcendent. The verb here translated bring, v'yikhu, literally means take. One who gives receives something in return. The sense of being generous and making a worthy undertaking possible, the sense of sharing with others in an important venture, the sense of self-worth that comes from knowing that we can give away something of value without feeling diminished. Okay, so some nice ideas here about what it means to donate for a religious cause. Okay, so it's 10 to noon. So let's stop here for today. Wish everybody a good rest of the day and a good rest of the week. And we'll see you all next Wednesday for another Torah study.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.